It's really great to see everyone here. We have 87 participants with the number going up all the time. I hope you're all well, and we'll take the opportunity to actively participate in the discussion that we're going to have today. We're very fortunate. We've got a great presenter, Rachel Brooks from UCL in the UK, who's going to talk about narratives of the nation in policy constructions of higher education students. Rachel is Professor of Higher Education at UCL and the Distinguished Executive Editor of the British Journal of Sociology of Education, which many of us regard as the premier theorised journal in the field, and are always very delighted to be included in if we ever do well enough to get there. Rachel's actively publishes, and she's done really important work with, some of it with Joanna Waters, on student mobility, which is highly cited. I think at this point I'll hand over to Rachel, but first, Rachel, if you don't mind, we'll just run through the protocols for the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website in due course. A transcript of the chat function conversation that goes on the side of your screen, if you bring up that function, and is often very interesting, will be posted as well. Please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view so that you can more clearly see who is talking. You can ask questions during the webinar or at the end of the presentation, and it's often a good idea to put your question in writing, so we'll then be able to identify the question and bring it up at the right time. There's two ways to get my attention to ask a question, and you can use the raise hand button, which is in the participants section on the screen, or you can get my attention by putting your question in the chat, and I do recommend doing that. When you're invited to ask a question, when we get to the Q&A session, please unmute yourself and then switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. So at this point, it's a delight to hand over to Rachel.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Can you see that okay? Okay. Can you hear me all right, Simon? Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to present today, and it's great to be doing it in this format with people joining us all over the world. So I feel quite privileged to be in this position. As Simon said, my paper's called Asserting the Nation, the Dominance of National Narratives in Policy Influences Constructions of Higher Education Students. I'm just going to start with a little bit of background to the research. So as you probably know, a European higher education area was set up in 2010 within Europe. And this really represents an attempt to standardise many aspects of higher education across the continent to enable students and staff to move unproblematically across national borders and ensure that the region of Europe is perceived as a competitive player in the global market for higher education. And scholars have suggested that the European higher education area and the Bologna process that helped bring it about have tended to foreground values more commonly associated with an Anglo-American model of higher education, such as marketisation and competition, rather than those that have traditionally underpinned higher education in continental Europe, including collegial structures of governance and the autonomy of higher education staff. It's therefore often argued that higher education systems across Europe are becoming more similar, with greater homogeneity observed in their approaches to teaching, methods of governance, and underpinning values. The pervasive neoliberalism of the late 20th and early 21st centuries is also have contributed to such processes. So drawing on these kinds of analyses, my presentation this afternoon considers the extent to which convergence is evident among key policy actors across Europe, particularly in relation to how they understand higher education students. Do they, for example, see all higher education students, wherever they study in the European higher education area, as broadly similar? Or do they differentiate between those in their own nation state and other parts of the continent? Analysing such discourses employed by policy actors is important, not only in teasing out the extent to which European higher education is indeed homogenising and whether distinctions are made between students of different national origins, but also because the language used by policymakers and others who influence policymaking processes can have a significant impact on the ways in which social groups are understood and society more generally is shaped. So the key argument that I want to make in my presentation today is that rather than foregrounding shared characteristics of students across Europe, policy actors tend to emphasise their differences, and explaining such differences draw on what can be viewed as distinct national narratives. Now, to help situate these arguments that I'm going on to make later in the presentation, I'm first going to just give you a brief overview of the literature in this area, drawing on scholarship from political science and history, as well as sociology and education. I'm then going to briefly talk about the research methods that underpinned this particular project, and then give you some examples of the ways in which national narratives were drawn upon to explain trends that empirical evidence would suggest are not unique to any one of the countries represented in the study. And then finally, I'll draw out some implications of these kind of narratives for European higher education and perhaps other social processes too. Okay, so within educational research, national narratives are most commonly discussed with respect to curricula and textbooks, arguing that the knowledge taught in schools is often selected to promote a particular view of the nation state. Such perspectives, I think, articulate with a larger body of work across the arts and social sciences, which explores the way in which national narratives are formed and the functions they serve in wider society. Historians have, for example, contended that such stories are important parts of projects to create...
Shall I just do it this way, please? It is just so much more satisfactory. So
I think somebody's got their microphone on.
Well, let me just get it up here first.
So historians have, for example, contended that such stories are important parts of projects to create and justify new forms of governing, evident in the formation of nation states in the 19th century, and more recently in the project of European integration. Nations need to be imagined, as Anderson famously argued, because most members of such communities will never know, meet, or hear their fellow citizens. Political scientists maintain that particular types of story, namely political myths, are important for legitimising specific forms of governance, and through forging a collective memory, establishing and then reinforcing bonds of community and solidarity. Moreover, international relations scholars have argued that national stories and political myths can help secure ontological security for the nation state. By this, they mean that states, like the individuals in Giddens' theory, and here I quote from Della Sala, seek security in ways that ensure a consistency in the narrative and stories they tell about who they are, what they do, and why. Narratives, including political myths, help provide this confidence. They provide a way to sequence events and the environment so that social actors can make choices in the faces of uncertainty, rooted in the familiar and the understandable. National narratives and political myths often share many key features. These include claims to exceptionalism, i.e. why the nation should be considered unique and the important ways it differs from others, an emphasis on transformational processes to help make sense of highly disruptive social processes, and the articulation of a utopian future. In addition, many national stories pay close attention to the boundaries around the nation. Self-definition is often achieved through delineation of the other. Such processes help determine, and here I quote, which strangers will be worthy of our sacrifices in the form of taxes, loss of personal freedom, military service, etc., and which will be excluded from sharing in the benefits of our community. National narratives may also be informed by or help reinforce wider geopolitical inequalities. For example, various scholars have argued that Polish national narratives often assume a peripheral geographical and political location framed primarily in relation to Western Europe. National narratives can also be backward-looking in nature, and here there's been some interesting research looking at Germany, and the argument here is that the importance of German reunification in national narratives has had the effect of closing down debate about current social and political issues which are not related to reunification. National narratives, the literature would suggest, are not, however, fixed. The boundaries established by narratives can be challenged by groups who feel excluded from them, as well as elite groups with considerably more power in society. There's also, I think, quite an important question whether national narratives are increasingly anachronistic in a globalised world where migration across national borders is common and cultural homogenisation evident. The empirical evidence suggests, however, that national stories remain strong in this shifting context. For example, Bouchard has argued that the nation as a vehicle of myths is still a powerful actor on the world scale, and it still possesses an amazing ability to redefine itself and to adapt to new environments. Moreover, there's little evidence that supranational organisations have had much success in developing competing narratives of their own. And there's been some interesting work in relation to the European Union on this point. So I hope that gives you a sense of some of the kind of literature that situates the study. I'm going to tell you a little bit now about the methods, because this is based on empirical data that we've been collecting through a European Research Council funded study called Eurostudents, a 5-year project which runs for just over another year. And the aim of this project is really to explore how students are socially constructed across Europe, to look at similarities and differences between countries, but also degrees of contestation within individual nation states between different types of social actor. So to explore these questions, we've been collecting data in 6 countries: Denmark, England, Germany, Ireland, Poland, and Spain. And we chose those countries because of the diversity they represent in terms of their welfare regime, their political systems, also their relationships to the European Union, the way higher education is funded, and the extent to which students are given financial support in those countries. The project is a kind of multi-strand project. There are 4 strands that look at 4 different types of social actor. So first of all, we're looking at students. We've conducted 54 student focus groups across the 6 nations. The second strand is an institutional strand, and here we've conducted 72 interviews with higher education staff and analysed 180 higher education institution websites. The third strand is a media strand, and here we've looked at how students are represented in newspapers in the 6 countries, analysing 1,159 newspaper articles. And we're currently looking at representations within TV shows and films from the 6 nations. But the part I want to really draw on today is the policy strand. And here we've analysed 92 policy documents in relation to higher education in the 6 countries, and conducted 26 interviews with policy actors. And it's really these interviews that I'll be drawing on heavily in the rest of the presentation. So in each country, we conducted between 4 and 6 interviews with at least one person from each of these groups. So the government, either civil servants or government ministers with responsibility for higher education, a representative of the National Students' Union, a representative of graduate employers organisation, and of a university leaders organisation. So in the UK, that was Universities UK. In mainland Europe, those organisations are often called rectors' conferences. And for each of these policy interviewees, we started off by asking them some fairly open-ended questions about how they understood higher education students. But these questions became increasingly specific, and we then asked them about specific constructions of students. Did they see students as, for example, significant political actors, future workers, people dedicated to learning, and consumers. So we had some constructions that are discussed quite a lot in the literature that we also asked them about. And then finally, we asked them to respond to a policy text from their own country. So that's the data that I'm going to be drawing on today. I'm going to go on now to make some of the kind of key arguments from that data. So it was striking in many of the interviews with the policy influencers that distinct national narratives were drawn upon quite frequently to explain what were believed to be key characteristics of higher education students from that particular country, even if the available empirical evidence suggests that the characteristics were in practice shared by students in many other parts of Europe. And so in this part of the presentation, I'm going to give you some examples of these key characteristics and national stories before going on to explore their significance in the next part of the presentation. And I'm going to be focusing on two main examples here. Students, firstly, as employment focused, and secondly, as politically apathetic. I've also written about a third example with students as interested in only academic qualifications, but there isn't time this afternoon to talk about that, but I'd be happy to go into more details in the Q&A afterwards if you're interested. So first of all, the construction of students as employment focused. A common theme across the data set as a whole was that over recent decades, students themselves, as well as the higher education sector as a whole, had become increasingly employment focused. This was evident, for example, in national policy documents where the construction of the higher education student as future worker was a common trope across all 6 countries. Policy influencers also talked at length about how the role of the student had increasingly come to be understood in relation to the labour market, and in Denmark, England, Poland and Spain, how steps have been taken to provide better information to prospective students about the labour market destinations and earnings of graduates from their chosen discipline, with the intention of guiding them towards degrees perceived as having better economic returns. However, while such themes were common across the 6 countries, they were typically discussed and explained in national terms, often with reference to very specific national histories. And the first example I'm going to draw on here is Ireland. So in Ireland, the close relationship between higher education and employment was discussed by several interviewees. And so in the first extract that you can see on the slide in front of you, a high-ranking civil servant responsible for higher education policy explains this relationship in terms of Ireland's experience of unemployment. And you can read that quotation for yourself, but I've highlighted what I think was perhaps the most interesting bit of that. It's where she talks about this kind of relationship being deep in the policy DNA here in a way that it mightn't be in other countries. And these kind of sentiments were echoed by other interviewees too. The Irish employers and university leaders representatives, for example, both emphasised the way in which education was a key part of the nation's history and culture, not least because it was seen as the most effective route out of poverty and into well-paid employment. So in the second quotation on that slide, you can see how this is talked about in terms of the kind of the history of being colonised in Ireland, and the route that education led out of that into work. And in the second quotation, this is again related to kind of the economic situation in Ireland, but they talk about it as being deeply ingrained in the Irish psyche for 150 years. So the perceived distinctiveness of the Irish experience was thus often explicit in many of these narratives. A second example is from Poland. So the Polish respondents also commented on the close relationship between higher education and employment, but in this case it was not always evaluated entirely positively. So in the first quotation from a civil servant who was responsible for higher education policy, he commented on the close relationship between higher education and employment, but believed that Polish students focused primarily on the labour market outcomes of their study, and that this differentiated them in a negative manner from their Western European counterparts. And as you can see from that quotation, He believed that Poland's relatively late embrace of capitalism explained the keenness of Polish students to secure well-paid jobs on graduation, and think of their higher education almost exclusively as a period of labour market preparation. The second quotation, which was from a government minister in Poland, draws on a somewhat similar comparison to explain Polish students' attitudes. And as far as he was concerned, students' expectations about the jobs they should be taking up on graduation were far too high, and they were often reluctant, in his view, to work their way up within organisations. And these were again attributed to Poland's recent economic and political history. The fact that the communist regime had only fallen relatively recently compared to, and that therefore the embrace of capitalism was much more recent in Poland than in other European nations. So while Irish and Polish interviewees remarked upon very similar trends among their student populations, trends that were evident in the other four nations too, these were explained through national narratives emphasising the distinctiveness of their particular historical trajectory. Discussion of wider transnational or global influence was notably absent. So that was the first example I wanted to talk about. The second example is the construction of students as politically apathetic. When they were asked about the extent to which they saw contemporary students as political actors, many of the policy influencers that we spoke to, although not all, commented on what they perceived to be the lower levels of political engagement among the student body when compared to previous generations. And in some cases, this was qualified with reference to participation in formal politics, noting that students may be more likely to become involved in single issue campaigns, for example, but were less likely to vote, join a political party, and get involved in student-led activism. And in many ways, this accords with the broader literature on political participation across Europe. There's now substantial evidence that young people, of whom students constitute a significant proportion, in many different national contexts are less likely to engage in formal politics than in the past, not because they're uninterested in politics, but because they're often highly critical of the ways in which formal politics is practiced. Nevertheless, despite these general patterns, policy influencers again made recourse to national narratives in their explanations. And the first example here is from Spain. I'll just give you some time to read those. So in both these extracts, the interviewees suggest that students' relative lack of engagement in formal politics can be explained by the more peaceful political circumstances in Spain, and specifically that they have been born into a democracy rather than, as was the experience of many of their parents, a dictatorship. Next, second example of political apathy comes from Poland. And in Poland, various interviewees also commented on the relative lack of political engagement by higher education students. Again, however, this was often explained in terms of factors specific to the nation state. For example, even the member of the Polish Students' Union who was interviewed outlined that students in general tended not to involve themselves in political issues, and when they did, their activity was usually focused on improving their own university experience rather than engaging with any wider concerns. He explained these patterns largely in terms of Poland's communist legacy. Under communism, he asserted, students had made a clear separation between education-related issues, which were deemed to constitute a legitimate focus for student activity, and issues with provenance beyond the university walls, which were not. And he explained, and this is the quotation I put on the slide, one of the main ideas in the communist period, which has endured, was to focus on the university and don't be political. This was the way that they avoided political problems. So, in both Spain and Poland, there was little recognition of the commonality of experience across national borders, or discussion of the various factors that are observed internationally, such as a disillusionment with politicians and the processes associated with formal politics, a lack of engagement with students and young people in general by politicians, and the growth of identity politics and single-issue campaigning. And again, we can see interviewees drawing on distinctly national stories to explain trends that can be observed in many other European countries, as well as across the global north more generally. So, despite the significant steps taken to establish a European higher education area predicated on the idea of shared commitments and values, as well as standardised approaches to teaching and assessment, the emergence of what is often thought to be a global higher education market and many common trends across higher education systems, such as massification, the increasing number of international students, closer relationships between universities and business, the dominance of national frames of reference within the data that I've been discussing this afternoon, I think, is striking. The extracts from interviews with the policy influencers in a number of European countries suggest that, in spite of the clear impact of globalizing pressures and transnational influences within education, significant change is often explained by key policy stakeholders through national narratives that foreground a country's history and its ostensible difference from other neighbouring states. While such narratives are clearly not identical to the national myths, which I talked about earlier in the presentation, not least because they focus on education rather than the development of a country more generally, they appear to share some features in common. Perhaps the most obvious of these is the focus on uniqueness, the ways in which the country in question is believed to have arrived at its current position through a very particular historical trajectory. This is evident, for example, in the reference to Spain's period under the Franco dictatorship to explain contemporary political apathy among students, and Ireland's experience of famine and colonisation to account for the high regard with which education is held and the employment focus of the Irish higher education sector as a whole. Now, undoubtedly, the values and orientations of students across the Six Nations in this study are informed, to some extent at least, by national histories, policies, and priorities. However, the absence of recourse to narratives about transnational and global influence, when these are well documented in, for example, official policy documents as well as academic studies, is intriguing. And I think the data from this study show how the dominance of national stories can help to obscure various transnational and global influences which transcend national borders, yet often have a very significant impact on the lives of many individuals. The project data do not provide any evidence that, for the countries concerned, the foregrounding of national explanations impedes engagement with wider issues or cross-national policy initiatives. However, I think it does suggest that if policy influencers adopt this kind of lens, they may tend to underplay both commonalities across nation states and the impact of influences beyond the nation state, both of which may have consequences for cross-national understandings, collaboration, and working. Such national narratives also support the contention that despite claims about the death of the nation state, it remains a very important unit of societal organisation and continues to shape collective identities in important ways. The narratives that I've presented this afternoon also speak, I think, to debates about the enduring importance of boundary making and the identification of others in constructions of national identity. In the data from Poland and to a lesser extent Spain, the policy influencers compare their countries negatively to other European nation states. Spanish students are seen as taking democracy for granted because of the country's transition from a dictatorship, while Polish students are positioned as materialistic, demanding and job-focused because of the country's relatively late transition to capitalism. In contrast, the Irish interviewees present a more positive picture of their country, taking pride in the employment focus of their students. Implicit and sometimes explicit in these stories is the sense of the other against which national understandings of students are constructed. Again, there are similarities with broader analyses of myths and imagined communities, which have emphasised the key role played by conceptions of the other in the construction of national stories and identities. So, to summarise, I think these narratives are significant because of the light they shed on understandings of the European higher education area, despite arguments within the academic literature on the increasing convergence of higher education systems across Europe. The policy actors' narratives suggest that in some cases, national frames of reference have not yet been usurped by European ones. They're also significant because of the ways in which they conceptualise students. The language used in policy and by policy influences can have significant effects. Words do more than name things. They impose limits on what can be said and construct certain possibilities for thought by ordering and combining words in particular ways and excluding or displacing other combinations. Thus, the emphasis on students as distinct from those in other parts of Europe may have a bearing on how they are understood by other social actors and also by students themselves. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I should just say that we have a project website where you can find out more about the other strands of the project. And we also have a project Twitter account, which you're very welcome to follow. And in terms of the arguments that I've been making today, I present these in more detail, drawing in other examples in the first article there, which was published in Sociological Research Online earlier this year. And then I made a brief reference to some of the constructions, the dominant constructions within the policy documents. And the reference for that is the 2019 paper in Compare. So thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have now.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel, for that clear and most interesting presentation. Already the chat has started to actively reflect on some of the themes which you've advanced, and we have a call list of questions. What I'm going to do is take the first three questions in this order. Amardeep Kumar from India, Aki Yanazawa from Japan, and David Mills from the UK. When you're called in to ask your question, take the mute off, turn on the video, and introduce yourself and where you're from. So can I, at this point, ask Amardeep Kumar to ask his question of Rachel?
Hello, thank you, Simon, and thank you, Rachel. I totally enjoyed your presentation. Just I wanted to know that how do students perceive about their social contribution in their national narratives?
Sorry, could you say that
social
again?
Contribution.
How do students perceive their social contribution in their national narrative?
The social contribution of higher education and of students, I guess.
Yes.
That's a really good question, and that's one of the things that we've been exploring throughout the different strands of the project. And perhaps in answering that question, it's more interesting if I focus on the student data, because the student said some really interesting things about that. And we did find, so I think across all the 6 countries, students felt that higher education was important in preparing them for work, like I was just saying in my presentation. But there were some quite interesting differences between countries in the extent to which they also thought it had some kind of collective purpose. So, for example, in Denmark, students talked about university, having a kind of much more of a kind of sense of kind of, building the nation state, the importance of them, giving back to the nation state. So it was seen in much less individualistic terms than, for example, in England and in some of the other countries, where students focus much more about, not about the social contribution, but about kind of, their employment trajectory afterwards. So I would say Denmark was at the one extreme, having this kind of sense of, higher education much more as a kind of public good. But we also saw strains of that argument in some of the other countries as well. So, for example, in Ireland, which is often thought to be quite close to England in terms of its kind of, neoliberal orientation, there were also some strains of that argument. So, for example, some students talked about how, Ireland's a very small country, it's quite dependent on its knowledge resources. Therefore, they were playing a really important part in developing their nation, not just advancing themselves as individuals. So we've started to write about that. But I think one of the things that we found that was quite interesting were those national differences there, and the extent to which kind of conceptions of higher education as a public good did differ quite a bit. And in terms of kind of explaining that, we might be unsurprised by that in Denmark, because that relates to kind of the social democratic orientation of the welfare regime there, but also the fact that higher education is funded by the state, and perhaps that makes it much easier to see it as a public good than in countries like England and then Ireland and Spain, where students make some significant financial contribution. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you both. Aki Yanazawa has the next question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very stimulating discussion. My question is quite simple, that how can we understand the difference of the impact of the national narratives, especially between different education level, I mean the undergraduate and the master and doctoral. Why it is so, why I'm asking this question is that in case of Japan, we have very limited number of the international students in undergraduate level, like 2%, simply because we teach in English, in Japanese, in national language in the undergraduate program mainly. But in a master program and doctoral program, it is much more international. About 20 to 30% of the students are international students. And then the labor market is much more open and not only limited to Japan. But the national policymakers has a quite different idea that is, they are much more thinking about the more nationalistic or the national the framework, even in the postgraduate education. So I'd like to know that to what degree your discussion about the narrative applied towards the beyond the undergraduate program. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's another good question. So I should say that in terms of our data collection, we restricted it to just undergraduates and just national students. So we didn't have any international students in our focus groups, because I felt that in a lot of countries, there are quite considerable differences between undergraduates and postgraduates, and also between national students and international students. So we had to draw the boundaries somewhere. But I think, so for example, and I think again, there is quite a lot of interesting sort of national variation here. So for example, in Denmark, doctoral students are typically treated as members of staff. They have a kind of, a salary, and whereas in England, they'd be treated, very much as kind of students. And then I think, there's variation across Europe in the extent to which a master's is seen as a kind of freestanding qualification, and the percentage of undergraduates who progress to masters. So for example, one of the kind of controversial things that the Bologna reforms have done is try to have much more of a split between the bachelor's qualification and the master's qualification, and that has been quite significant and has led to quite a degree of change in Germany. Whereas in Denmark, although there has been quite a lot of government encouragement of this split, actually students and staff have been very resistant, and most people still treat it as one qualification and kind of go assume that they will go through to a master's. But I think actually in relation to the kind of debates about national narratives, this came through quite strongly from the policy perspective, but it wasn't something that really came through very strongly from the student perspective. I guess because they were much more talking about like their day-to-day lives, whereas the policy actors, I suppose they had a longer time frame in which to make comparisons and were aware of some of these larger debates. And I think one of the things that was quite interesting was a lot of the policy actors were well plugged into European networks. So they've often visited other European countries. And so it was quite interesting that they seemed to have quite a good understanding of what was going on in other European countries. So we're quite happy to kind of make comparisons, but interestingly not to employ European frames of reference. So, and that's a bit of a kind of a digression from the question you asked, but I think we didn't see this sort of feeding through in the same kind of way in the other strands of the project. Although, as I said in response to the other question, there were some quite significant national differences in things about the purpose of higher education, the social contribution of higher education.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Again, thank you both. And our next question is from David Mills.
Thank you, Simon. Again, organising it. Rachel, I really enjoyed that. A quick thought, really, which is quite a scary one, a bit parochial. It's almost 4 years since Brexit, this month, very sadly. So your research will have been done all the way since, in the shadow of that concern around what that meant for European identity and European integration. And there was a lot of fear initially, wasn't there, that other European countries might follow. How do you think that might have shaped the context in which the responses were being made? Because your policy actors are clearly seeing themselves employed by national governments and therefore, having to spin the national line to a certain extent. Did you ask them explicitly about Erasmus and mobility schemes like that? And obviously, they didn't bring them up, it seems. Do you think that's because it just was not seen as sort of the right thing to say, you know, in an era of subsidiarity? So in your question, not yet usurped by the European ideal, perhaps actually what you are doing, what you're seeing is a move back from, you know, the European project during this period.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, and I have thought a lot about that over the past few years. I mean, I suppose at a very practical level, right at the start of the project, I was really worried that, you know, that Brexit decision had been just taken. It would be impossible for me as a British person to get access to European universities. But actually, you know, there was a lot of sympathy about that, and that didn't crop up at all. And so we expected actually that to crop up, you know, explicitly in the interviews. We didn't ask about it directly, but I did expect it to crop up, and was very surprised that it was hardly brought up at all. And it was only really in relation to when we asked some English members of staff about students as political actors that they felt Brexit had quite an impact there, although that wasn't actually. That wasn't reflected in the student data very much. For the staff, you know, that was the only place I think in which it occurred. But I think we've done quite a lot of thinking about how ideas about, you know, Europe frame other parts of the project. And within the policy documents, there is a slightly kind of different framing than the one I was talking about today. So, for example, but only occurs really in Germany. So in Germany, one of the things we looked at were speeches by higher education politicians or, you know, secretaries of state for higher education, ministers for higher education, etc. And actually in the German data, there is quite a lot of positioning students as European through the Erasmus scheme and that kind of thing. And in the German data, there are a lot more positive comments about the Bologna process than we find anywhere else. In Spain, we have some also kind of positive, in the policy documents, some positive discussion about Europe. But when we did we did a kind of account of the number of times Bologna and Europe and associated terms were mentioned, and they're mentioned most in Germany, and then a fair bit in Spain, but almost entirely absent from England and Denmark. And when we've written about this, we've talked about the kind of the influence of Euroscepticism in those two countries. I mean, obviously really explicitly in England, but I think if you look at like the political history of Denmark, there's been a lot of sort of soft Euroscepticism there, which again I think makes it politically very hard for Europe to be talked about in a positive sense by politicians. And so in other things we've written from the project, where we've looked more at the policy documents, not just what the policymakers told us, I think we do see more complicated narratives coming in which do reference Europe in ways, and we do see differences between the countries which map on, I think, quite closely to their position relative to the European project, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you.
Well, so politics remains nation-bound, and higher education remains nationally situated in most of Europe. So it's all a great challenge for us internationalists who embrace the European project and see it as having made a difference. Perhaps it hasn't made as much difference yet as we think it has. I've got a couple more people waiting, and I'd like to bring in Rita Hordozi at this point to ask a question, if Rita is listening.
Indeed. Hi, Richard, that was great. I would be really interested in whether anyone was referencing kind of regional similarities. So have the Polish talked about regional issues in relation to conceptualizing the student?
Can I just clarify, by regional, do you mean like the region of Europe, or do you mean the subnational?
Yes, subnational. So for example, in Eastern Europe, have they referenced, Poland, has Polish people referenced Eastern Europe as a frame?
So I think in Poland there was lots of talk about sort of post-communist countries being different from Western Europe in the kind of ways that I was talking about in the presentation. But I think in the other countries there wasn't that kind of referencing. And I think, I mean, I've written a paper that talks about kind of, the extent to which comparisons were drawn. So as I was saying in answer to a previous question, the policymakers were actually, very good at spontaneously making comparisons with other European countries, because clearly they were moving at that level and attending Bologna follow-up groups and that kind of thing. In relation to the student data, it was really interesting that we got students, it was only in Spain that students made reference to what students in other parts of Europe might be like. And we were really intrigued by that. And we've been sort of thinking about why that might be. And there is a literature, I think, on the importance of Europe to the side of Spain sense, and that it's, that it's seen as a kind of, a really helpful kind of developmental path for Spain, and Europe is seen in many ways in quite a positive light. So we thought that maybe kind of that was one reason, but also perhaps also flows of students, because Spain is such a popular destination for Erasmus students and other mobile students in Europe, that perhaps also they were kind of just seeing kind of a wider range of students from other parts of Europe. But also I think in the Spanish student data, I mean, we've written another paper about this, and this is a whole nother story, but basically across Europe, the student narratives were very positive about what it means to be a student. They were full of the joy of learning. It was really kind of heartening from that perspective. But Spain was a real outlier in the sense that they felt very depressed about their higher education, didn't see the prospects of entering the labour market as very good for them at all, and were really critical about the higher education they were receiving. And I think in making some of those arguments, they drew on these kind of wider frames of reference to make their point that actually in other parts of Europe, students were getting a much better deal, employment was much higher, they found the transition to the labour market much better. So these kind of different frames differed, I suppose, in terms of the country that we were looking at, but also I think the strand of the research. So for example, the policymakers, as you would probably expect, made these kind of comparisons much more readily than students did. And at the student level, it was mainly in Spain that we saw these comparisons being made, not in other countries.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both. Next question is from Richard Edelstein, and I think it goes to the labour market.
Yes, good morning, or I guess good afternoon in Europe. Anyway, it's just a question of whether in your interviews with policy people or with students, you found any recognition or reference to a European labor market, not limited to the national labor market, or either positively or negatively, but I didn't hear you bring that up in particular.
Yeah, thank you. That's another good question. I suppose that and it wasn't something that was brought up very much at all. I suppose the two instances I can think of was in relation to those German speeches that I talked about when Erasmus was discussed explicitly, and it was along with kind of very positive discussions of European mobility, that mobility as a student was really important for future labour market mobility, and I don't know, the welcoming of strangers and that kind of thing. So that's the only time in which I can, in the policy documents that we analysed, that I can think of it talked about in that kind of explicit and positive way. And in relation to the student data, again, I think this only came up really in Spain as a kind of way out of national difficulty, because as I was saying, the Spanish students were really concerned about their transitions into the labour market and were worried about that, and did talk about having to leave their country. But I suppose it was presented as a kind of a backup plan if things didn't work out nationally. And I suppose that, thinking about the data more generally, that was the sense that I think I got from it, that most people, when they were talking about getting jobs in the future, did tend to talk in national terms. So for example, I mentioned in Ireland, some of the students talking about higher education being an important means of supporting the national economy and the importance of kind of the national knowledge resources, and that kind of argument was also made in Denmark as well. So I mean, because we didn't ask an explicit question about it, I wouldn't like to kind of be too strong on this, but in terms of the kind of the unprompted ways in which people did discuss labour markets, my sense is that they were tending to construct those in quite national terms.
Right. Okay. Just one other point. I found it interesting that you mentioned in Denmark, you were referencing the Bologna reforms, and that in that master's degrees were viewed differently but across countries. And in my own research, I found that to be really quite present and remarkable, that there's a lot of labeling that goes on, but in fact, I'm more familiar with France, but the system itself in terms of degrees really hasn't changed that much. They've labeled them differently. So I think it's a very interesting area, and just in terms of how nation states or individual nations adapt to the transnational kind of policy context. But in fact, when the policies are implemented, there's a lot of informal and sometimes more formal negotiations that go on in terms of the national meaning of those things. Anyway, very interesting.
Yes, I would agree. Yes, yeah.
Very nice work.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I'd like to bring in Doria Abdallah at this point.
Hi. Good evening from Malaysia. I'm not... So I really like your presentation just now. And I think from Malaysia side, we can actually draw parallels to one particular part that you presented, which is on the employment focus. Now, my question is, perhaps it is not being presented just now. Do the students find parallels or agree to what have been described in the policy documents, their identity as students? Perhaps you can briefly describe based on the sample of countries that you have presented just now. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that was a good question in a sense. I mean, that was one of the key things I was interested in exploring in the project. So in the student focus groups, we gave them an extract from a policy, a kind of, a fairly influential policy in their own country, and just asked them to discuss that. And I suppose in most of the countries, there was a quite high level of contestation between how they were represented in policy and how they understood the view of themselves as a student. Now that kind of, it differs a bit from country to country, because the policy extract that we gave them obviously differed, but in general, I mean, I would say across the 6 countries, there were very few students who felt that they were being portrayed in a fair or accurate way within official policy documents, and were quite articulate in explaining that. But the nature of that difference obviously differs from country to country, because the policy impetus was different. But I mean, just to go back to the previous question, actually, I'll give you one example. So, for example, in Denmark, there have been a lot of policies over recent years to encourage students to move more quickly through their studies, and perhaps not automatically to assume that they'll progress to a master's degree. And that was highly contested by the students, that they thought actually that this kind of compromised the values of the kind of Humboldtian higher education system, which is all about the kind of freedom to learn, freedom to direct the own pace of your learning. And so they felt that actually, kind of how they were being portrayed in policy as too slow and kind of lazy, compromised their understanding of themselves as students. And maybe it goes back to what I was talking about in the presentation, that actually I think, this was perhaps a case where students were alluding to kind of, national cultures and national histories, the fact that, they associated themselves much more with a kind of continental model of higher education than the model they felt that was being imposed on them. And they didn't talk about the imposed model as kind of Anglo-American, but I think it was that sense of, emphasis on efficiency, of getting people through quickly, that they objected to.
Well, thanks again to you both. And Doria, it was good to have Malaysia on the show. I'd like to pass now to Johannes Hockruther, who has a question about the UK's position, I think.
Yes, thank you very much for taking the question. You mentioned in your article that your English interview partners were refraining from invoking the UK's national narrative because of the shared nationality. So could you please, for an international audience, elaborate a little bit on what you think the UK's national narrative would be, especially against the backdrop of the global convergence of higher education systems towards an Anglo-American scheme, thereby possibly making the Anglo-American view on students a global view on students?
I mean, it's a bit hard for me to kind of guess because, you know, that wasn't really something that the UK respondents talked about. Yes, I should say for other people who are part of the seminar, in the written article upon which is this based, I say that, you know, these kind of national narratives weren't really explained by our English interviewees, and my kind of, you know, reflection on that is because perhaps because they assumed that I shared the same kind of national background, they didn't need to say these things. But I suppose thinking about kind of the other parts of our data, I mean, I think there's almost a kind of, you know, and I mean, this has been discussed in the news in Britain recently, but a kind of British exceptionalism that actually, you know, we haven't had to change our models much. We've stuck with our 3-year degree. The Bologna process hasn't had much impact on us. And so I think, you know, that can be linked to the fact that, you know, Europe just isn't mentioned at all in the policy documents and in the interviews. And, you know, obviously internationalization is mentioned a lot, but typically that is about people coming to the UK rather than us, you know, kind of learning from other countries. So I would say in terms of the kind of, you know, the attributes of a national narrative or a political myth, probably the kind of exceptionalism comes through in the UK context, but exceptionalism in terms of, you know, kind of not having to take on board European agendas, that we just do things our own way. So the people I interviewed might say that's completely unfair because I didn't ask them that question, but that would just be my kind of, you know, speculation about kind of if we had to identify some kind of English national narrative, that kind of exceptionalism, I think, would be my best guess of what we might find.
Thanks, Rachel, for a difficult answer to a difficult question. That one. I'd like to bring in Giulio Marini if he's online. Hello, Giulio. Are you out there?
Hi.
There he is.
Thank you, Rachel. I have quite curiosity. It's about the role of regions in Spain. Do students refer and speak about different comunidades in Spain, and does it? I don't know if you got my question. Maybe I had some problems with
Giulio, we're losing sound here. I think if you could repeat slowly the question.
Yes. My question was about Spanish regions in Spain. So do students in Spain refer to Spanish regions as a kind of political entity and as a kind of factor for them?
So as far as I remember from the Spanish data, it was more kind of when we were discussing kind of them as political actors, that was, I suppose, in the context when we were talking to students themselves and members of staff, that was the context in which political activity was talked about most, I suppose, because one of our universities was in Barcelona, and it was, you know, around the time when there'd been quite a lot of political activity there about autonomy, and certainly the campus in terms of, you know, the kind of the physical environment, you know, it looked, you know, as if there was a lot of political activity going on there. But I think in terms of kind of, you know, national narratives, if that's what you're trying to link back to, there wasn't much sense of those regional identities kind of, you know, compromising the national narrative, if you see what I mean. Because when we spoke to policymakers, people operating at the national level, you know, the Students' Union representative as well, I suppose that didn't come into their discourse at all. It was more, I suppose, when we were talking to members of staff who were reflecting on the political activity of their students at their university in areas where regional autonomy had been a significant political issue, that did come up. But I would say at the national level, much less so.
We've reached the end of our time, and I want to sincerely thank Rachel for sharing this hour with us and also bringing the piano to us and the data set. The data set really, really useful, really interesting commonalities and differences between the countries. So we look forward to the publications. At this point, can I ask you if there's anything you want to say in conclusion?
No, I'd just like to say thank you everybody for your great questions. They were very thought-provoking, and yeah, thank you for giving up the time today to join us.
Yes, thanks to everyone. It's great to have everyone here at the webinars, and we held 100 participants pretty well all the way through. So we look forward to seeing you next week. We're going to open 2 webinars a week from next week onwards, and we'll be having webinars on Tuesday and on Thursday. Or actually, I should check that and say I think the first Tuesday webinar starts the following week. Anyway, I'll check my itinerary, but in 10 days' time, we'll certainly be looking at 2 webinars a week because there's been significant demand for the opportunity to discuss and present, and we seem to be holding large audiences on a worldwide basis. So very good. It's very good to have the discussion. Very good to have everyone here. Keep your spirits up. We will get through this difficult period. We're doing good work, many of us. And we know there are great challenges ahead, but working together will help us meet those challenges. See you next week. Bye-bye.